Hi. Okay, we're getting somewhere. Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Nadia Abel-Haj from the Center for Palestine Studies, and I'm actually really very briefly introducing the event and the person who's actually going to introduce our speaker. So I want to start by thanking not just this is organized by CPS, but the Heyman Center for the Humanities and the Institute for Religion, ICPRL, Culture and Religion in Public Life. Is that right? I always know it as ICPRL. Okay. As ICPRL for sponsoring this with us. We're really pleased to have Sherene Seikaly here, and but I'm going to introduce Lena Thatur, who is going to invite her because this is really Lena's project and invitation to get Sherene here. So Lena is an assistant professor of global development at the University of New South Wales, so she came a very long way for this project. And she was with us at the Center for Palestine Studies as the Ibrahim Abu-Lughod postdoctoral fellow in 2019, 2020. So in fact, we never got to say goodbye because she left in March, as did many people flee the city. She's currently completing her first manuscript, book length, called Ambivalent Resistance, Palestinians in Israel and the Liberal Politics of Settler Colonialism and Human Rights. And she's also co-editing, together with Ronit Lenton, a book provisionally titled Race and the Question of Palestine, which in fact is the intellectual inspiration for this event. So Lena, I hand you the podium.
Well, I feel too short for this, but it's wonderful to be here again and to see so many familiar faces again. It is my great pleasure to introduce the speaker for this evening, who many of you know, Professor Sherene Seikaly. Professor Seikaly is an associate professor of history at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and she's the co-editor of Journal of Palestine Studies and Jadaliyya. Her first book, Men of Capital, Scarcity and Economy in Mandate Palestine, that came out with Stanford University Press, explores economy, territory, the home, and the body, contributing to social, cultural, and intellectual history, political economy, cultural studies, and gender studies. Her forthcoming book, From Baltimore to Beirut on the Question of Palestine, places Palestine in a global history of race, capital, slavery, and dispossession. This important project, from which she will be presenting today, really pushes the boundaries of race analysis of Palestine in significant ways. It does so by paying particular attention to race formations in Palestine and by moving beyond romanticization of Black Palestinian solidarity towards exploring Palestinian relationship with whiteness, Blackness, and anti-Blackness. She opens difficult and uncomfortable questions, but as she always reminds us, and I'm quoting you on this, it is only through those difficult questions that we can imagine other futures. Please join me in welcoming Professor Seikaly.
Hi, everyone. It's such an honor to be here. And I want to thank in particular Lena, who's such an amazing inspiration to me, and the directors of the Center for Palestine Studies, Brian Boyd, Nadia Abel-Haj, thank you all. And yeah, I mean, I am really so happy to be on the East Coast and with you all here today. And I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts. So I'm beginning tonight not with Palestine, but with California, where I live and work. California is battered. 11 atmospheric river storms, which are basically corridors of air and water that produce landslides, sinkholes, and downed trees, have hit the state this year. In fact, we've had 400 to 600% of our average rainfall. Oh, yay, something worked today, yay. in just the first quarter of 2023 alone. And here you see an aerial photograph that shows a car and market shop in floodwaters in Pajaro, California, just this last month. As we all know, climate catastrophe is relentless. It is a generalized condition of our time, what we could call an eternal, interminable present. We are together in this lunar landscape of ruination. And here, this is another image, which is from March 26, when a massive tornado ripped through the community of Rolling Fork. So what I've tried to do since this year began, it's hard to see you if my reading glasses are on, because I have not taken the step of getting bifocals, which is, I'm getting there. It's just taking me a minute. So I'll be going back and forth. What I've tried to do since 2023 has started is to assemble an inventory of catastrophe, of climate catastrophe. And it's really gone on for pages, from drought-stricken Somalia to flood-hit Pakistan. And this kind of disaster and its accelerating pace is also accompanied by mass extinction, right, of animals, of vegetation, of plants. We live in a world of generalized catastrophe, in a condition of trouble without end. How do we hold ground, persist, and subsist on an earth giving way to mudslides, fire, floods, and drought, on an earth eroding under the force of unbridled greed? And how can we imagine futures differently while grieving what has been lost? As we mark the 75th anniversary of the inception of the Nakba, I want to think through these questions by centering Palestine both in the present and historically, neither as a laboratory nor as a problem, but as an abundance of lessons on race and catastrophe, and on living in the intervals of grief. I do this work as a child of a Palestinian woman and man who became, like 750,000 other Palestinians, refugees in 1948. I am a product and a scholar of what we call our ongoing Nakba that spans the 100 years of denial of Palestinian political rights and peoplehood. Catastrophe is not in the future. The Nakba is not in the past. What has felt like this interminable present of Palestinian life under siege came to the fore once again last week with Israel's shelling of Gaza, the video recordings of Israeli police beating worshipers in Al-Aqsa while pleas to God punctuated the soundscape, the way that Ramadan, a month of reflection and prayer, is transformed into a time of vigilance and brutality. Holding ground is ever more frightening, ever more urgent. And here I want to also register the epistemic violence and its weight when brutal beatings of prostrate bodies become clashes, or the practice of i'tikaf becomes a menacing barricade, the worshiper a terrorist. So basically, I tried to do a parallel exercise to my inventory of climate catastrophe. Actually, that's not entirely true, because I have the great honor of co-editing the Journal of Palestine Studies with Rashid Khalidi. And every 4 months, we actually try to do this inventory in our editor's note, and it's always painful, and it's always important, and it always exceeds our capacities. Where to begin with the last 4 months? Do we start in 2022, which was the deadliest year on record for Palestinians in the West Bank since 2005? Do we start with 2023, when the government of far-right settlers and religious extremists took power? Do we start with the third day of January, when settler leader and Minister of National Security Itamar Ben-Gvir entered the Aqsa compound accompanied by a cluster of police officers? Hello. We could begin with any number of dates and events on this endless inventory that, again, while familiar, needs to be listed in detail, committed carefully to memory. And here I want to gesture also to a temporality of escalating settler violence that we must carefully attend to. In fact, we know that from January 2023 until today, Israeli settler violence against Palestinians have averaged at 3 incidents a day. In that vein, I think it's important to choose for now February 26th as a starting point. That day, 400 settlers descended on the village of Hawara and neighboring villages, armed with weapons, iron bars, clubs, and incendiary materials. There's more space if you all want to. They burned down dozens of homes. In one case, with the inhabitants still inside, they set fire to hundreds of cars, stealing goods, shooting and killing one Palestinian, and injuring more than 350 others. They also set fire to side streets to prevent Palestinian firefighters from intervening. And what you see here is an aerial view of the destruction caused by the Israeli settlers in Hawara. It's been very interesting to see how many people, from the head of the Israeli Army Central Command, Major General Yehuda Fuchs, to the right-wing Nahum Barnea, and reaching into a broad spectrum of organizers, have taken to calling this event a pogrom. But as we look on to interrupted lives and incinerated homes, cars, and businesses, and take in the rapid pace of this inventory, it's important to remember that Palestinians have a word for this relentless landscape of colonial impunity and ethnic cleansing: Nakba. Nakba appears in fragmentation, in the fragmentation of land and in various repertoires of violence across the reach of historic Palestine. This fragmentation parallels the multiple scales of racialization that Palestinians endure: the constant siege of all-out assault in Gaza, Bantustanization, separation, confinement in the West Bank, the flimsy abeyance of permanent residency in Jerusalem, second-class citizenship inside the Green Line, and the shatat globally, the experience of exile globally. In each of these places, Palestinians are dispossessed not only of land, but of time. They reside in a state of the permanent, temporary, made possible by what I want to think through today as cumulative dispossession. So what does cumulative dispossession on the ground look like? It looks first like the constant availability to premature death, and we see this in the devastating numbers of children killed in Israeli days, in Israeli raids. And again, this is an inventory that is necessary but incredibly painful. We see it in the farewell notes that children have taken to packing in their school bags in case they never come home. But there's another indicator of cumulative dispossession, and that is a deep and abiding colonial fear. We saw this fear in May 2022 after an Israeli sniper shot veteran journalist Sherene Seikaly. And thousands of Palestinians across class, gender, sectarian, and political divides carried her to her final resting place, chanting, "We may die, but Palestine will be free." Israeli police beat pallbearers, ripped down the Palestinian flag, and nearly toppled Abu Akleh's coffin. We see this colonial fear every day. If you're following the news, you see it in the ways that breaking a fast and a long table of food becomes a target. We see it to the targeting and constricting of picnickers, of children playing in public squares. So the very possibility of Palestinian being in its everyday articulations of mourning and joy, of fasting and feasting, of being together in space is the threat. And while this government, the Netanyahu government, is certainly a cautionary tale of how things can and will get worse, the threat of Palestinian being exists in the longue durée. So basically, I'm just saying here, the existential threat works both ways. right? And we see this, we saw it last August in the attacks on the 6 Palestinian organizations and the always already process of archival violence. Every day you can see this dynamic of premature death and colonial fear. And here I want to just remind us of the words of scholar and organizer Ilyas Shufani, who pointed out in the late 1960s, quote, "A settler society in the midst of large indigenous populations cannot withstand the feeling of vulnerable existence." So in the face of this vulnerability, dispossession intensifies. So how do we find pockets of possibility in all of this? How do we build toward coalitions, towards effective action? And for me, the political and the intellectual are always at pace with each other. And the reason I think I'm doing a little bit better is because my therapist is teaching me that taking care of myself is also political, which is really revolutionary. So more to come on that experiment. But what I want to try and shift to now is to think together and to follow Audre Lorde's directive to really try and settle for nothing less than the hard work of excavating honesty. I took this photograph of Colombia checkpoint in 2003 when it was much smaller than it is today. I always traveled then with a camera, so this was before the iPhone is what it is now. And the camera always made me an object of suspicion from which the US passport would shield me, even if only momentarily, before the soldier looked at the box place of birth. So in this photo, we see an Ethiopian soldier, right? And this soldier should be a reminder to us of the systemic anti-Blackness and police brutality in Israel, of inordinate rates of Ethiopian incarceration, of the demographic violence of forced contraception administered to Ethiopian immigrant women. But the scene also echoes of a checkpoint that shows up in a book called Afro-Pessimism by Frank Wilderson. Yeah, okay. Where he recounts the story of his Palestinian friend Samir, who explains how when he's at the checkpoint that he feels a heightened sense of shame and humiliation if the soldier searching him is a Black Ethiopian. And so from this, Wilderson says he surmises that the Palestinian insurgent in his subconscious, because of his anti-Blackness, is more like Israeli state and society than Black people, okay? So I wanna do two things in this moment with Wilderson and with this photo, which is really to take on the imperative of Palestinian anti-Blackness, at the same time that I want to demand that we attend to the multiple positionalities and subjectivities that are in this photograph. The Israeli soldier who is Ethiopian, who is subject to systemic racism, the Palestinian woman, and the Palestinian American taking the photograph. I also want to say that my reading of this photograph has changed when I encountered another Ethiopian, or she could have been Eritrean, woman in my family archive whose name was Sada, and you'll get to meet her soon. Basically, what I want to do here is invite us all into the cold winds of self-scrutiny. Again, here, Audre Lorde. And no one has really taught me those lessons of self-scrutiny more than my ancestors, who I'm going to be talking about for the rest of my talk. And I want to share what they've taught me about race and catastrophe. So these are my great-grandparents. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about them. Naim Kotran was born in 1877. He dies in 1961. We're not really sure about the exact dates of his birth, but he's born in the northern coastal city of Acre in Palestine, then under Ottoman rule. He began his education at the Syrian Protestant College in Beirut, And I think he partied too hard and didn't make it there. So he had to go to Baltimore to the University of Maryland. Seriously, this is what the family says, that they all went to Sierra Palestine. They partied too hard and they couldn't make it. And so they had to go to the University of Maryland, where a lot of actually Arab students are getting medical degrees. So it was very super interesting. In 1910, Naim returns to Palestine and marries Sherene Seikaly, who is at the time 14, another part of the story. And her parents gift them an enslaved woman named Sada. Naim and Sherene manumit Sada, but she lives and dies with them as their domestic servant. Naim would become one of Acre's first registered medical doctors, but before that happened, and shortly after their marriage, Naim, Sherene, and Sada would go to Sudan, where Naim served as a medical official in the Anglo-Egyptian government. I don't know if you can see this photo, or we might need to dim the lights a little bit. But this is a photograph of my great-grandparents 1 year in 1949, 1 year after the fateful 1 year after the fateful twin birth of the Israeli state and the inception of the ongoing Nakba. 8 miles northeast of Acre, in a village called Nahr al-Naba, Naim and Sherene owned about 20 hectares of land. And here they're standing on the grounds of their burnt orchards my great-grandfather would petition time and again were my private property. If I were to begin in this moment, I would only be studying Zionist and British movements, commercial enterprises, and power. But 1948 was only one moment of my great-grandparents' lives. And to learn what they have to teach me, I can't just ask, how did they become refugees? I have to ask also and investigate other subjectivities they inhabit. And that story is more troubling, richer, and in some ways more instructive. It demands from me that I move beyond the frameworks of national and colonial logics that have shaped my thinking, and to some extent, the struggle for Palestine. In this photograph, Sada stands behind Naim, if you can see her. Sada was likely Ethiopian, perhaps she was Eritrean. Her life was disrupted by slavery, consistent with well-documented markets for human trafficking in the Eastern Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula. Since at least the 2nd century and into the present, the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean slave trade in this part of the world has flourished, and often drawing from markets in Sudan and Ethiopia to staff armies and households with unpaid labor. And in the 19th century, in this market, often enslavers regarded Ethiopians as superior to other East Africans, and also as kind of ranked aesthetically between white, Circassian, and East African enslaved women. And this really reflects a sexual vulnerability of women abducted into slavery. Everybody with me? Okay, cool. So I want to gesture here to scholars of slavery in the Middle East, because I think it's really important to think together with them. So people like Eve Trout Powell, Ehud Toledano, Terrence Waltz, Kenneth Cuno, and these people really paved the way to think critically about this history. They challenged a kind of long-held insistence that in comparison to the transatlantic slave trade, enslavement in the Middle East is colorblind or mild or even benign. This is a very obstinate and ongoing insistence, right? And building on this work, there's a whole new generation of scholars, Taylor Moore, Bam Willoughby, Bayan Abu Bakr, many different young scholars who are really trying to show and insist and reveal that Black people are both indigenous to the Middle East and North Africa, as well as being part of a broader African diaspora. So the traces of Saada's life remind us here that slavery is a 20th century story, and both the slave trade and slaveholding in Palestine were active under Ottoman rule, while the British Mandate government would officially end slavery with the inception of their colonization of Palestine in 1917. Demand and commerce actually continued. And this is something that a lot of these scholars that I mentioned have shown us, which is that British missionary projects actually work to protect the slave trade. And I think that's also another important dynamic. Most of what we know about slavery in Palestine is limited to the Naqab, where Palestinian Bedouins enslaved Africans. And today, the descendants of those people largely identify Sudan and Ethiopia as their ancestors' homes. So Saada lived in my ancestors' urban household, and she reminds us of Saidiya Hartman's kind of invitation to think of the kitchen as a social history of servility, racism, and sexual domination. And her experience of manumission did not really result in a substantively different life. She continued to work in the home and died there. So this suggests that her duties basically remained the same. Although everybody in the family refers to her, oh, she was part of the family, she was part of the family, up until my parents kind of say this narrative, right? Well, she was just part of the family. Everybody came to her funeral. But what I want to suggest is that this sort of, she was just part of the family move is a kind of violence of disavowal, and disavows the sort of limits of what that manumission looked like, except for this really rare piece of evidence in this photograph, which you probably can't make out too well. But in this photograph, it's the same photograph you just saw, but Saada is taken out of it to make way for the true family. I want to just say here that two things, which is that since I began to trace Saada's trajectory, I've learned that she was by no means exceptional, right? Almost every family of the class background that I've spoken to has a history of this. That's number one. Number two, I think Saada really opens windows into dialectics of ownership and dispossession. So my great-grandparents owned a person and were dispossessed of land. And now I am here and I'm fighting against archival erasure. But I'm also afforded a glance into Saada's life that her ancestors are denied, right? So I'm also taking part in a certain kind of erasure. Okay, so this picture, although my parents and I argue about this all the time, I believe from the photographs that I have, which are about 80 photographs, I believe that this picture is actually taken in Sudan. So I want to tell you the story of Sudan quickly. People are still with me? Okay, cool. All right. So in this image, you see, and again, a lot of these dates are just my estimation that I try to figure out from how old people look in the photos and the history of what's happening. So you see in this image here, it's probably taken around 1916. Naim is sitting cross-legged, authoritative. He's wearing a pith helmet. There are two Black Sudanese men standing at his sides. And that young man, Naim, with his kind of elaborate mustache and his colonial affect, probably couldn't have imagined in this year that the people he emulated would be the source of his own dispossession. But here, the point that I'm really invested in is that it was not simply the British or later the Israelis that held tightly to civilizational logics. Naim, too, also believed himself to be culturally and racially superior. That logic, of course, would shatter in the wake of dispossession, but I'm interested in thinking about how it took shape and what it can teach us today. So my estimation is that Naim arrives in Sudan around 1911, and he's working in the Durman Civil Hospital where this image is taken. And he's taking part in the Anglo-Egyptian condominium, which was one station in the British colonization of Sudan, which had been established about a dozen years before in 1899. The Sudan Medical Service was a really important arm of the colonial enterprise, the British colonial enterprise, to map, know, and rule Sudan. And in many other contexts, as in many other contexts, medicalization and colonization are working hand in hand. And in this endeavor, the British colonial government are actively recruiting Syrian Christian medical doctors. Why? Well, on the one hand, they're following closely the ideas of Lord Cromer, who's ruling Egypt and Sudan from 1883 to 1907. And Cromer really understood Syrian Christians to be morally, socially, and intellectually superior to their Muslim brethren. British officials are also freaking out because the Egyptians are organizing for self-determination. So they certainly don't want the Egyptians working in Sudan. So they understand men like Naim to be anti-national, passive, apolitical, and white. And this language of whiteness, the British are using it, and people like Naim are using it in multiple different contexts. And it is linked to confessionalism and their Christianity. One of the things that's also really important to understand is that these men, when they were recruited, were really understood also as perfect for mapping and colonizing southern Sudan. And here it's really crucial to gesture to what Ahmed Sikayinga teaches us, which is that the kind of claims that northern Sudanese people would make to Arabness, right, were in conversation and relation and in opposition to the Blackness and enslavability of southern Sudan. So I just want to tell you a couple of things about the field of medicine in early 20th century. This is the stuff that I'm in right now. I have like 400 pages of notes. The people who love me in this room are like, please just start writing. And I'm like, no, I don't know enough. I don't know enough. I have to read another book and then I have to annotate the book. So I have a lot to say about this. And also Sudan is just like, brings me out of my comfort zone in the most exciting ways. But one of the things that's happening here is how the field of medicine is taking place both in institutions and outside of it. So there are three main institutions: civil hospitals, military hospitals, and the link between military and medicine is so instructive. And a really crazy place called the Wellcome Tropical Research Laboratory. If you've been to London and you've gone to the Wellcome, you know they have the best high tea. Also, Wellcome was a major white supremacist and a CEO of a pharmaceutical corporation. So he sets up this laboratory because of his own white supremacy fantasies. No matter. See, I told you, it's very rich. So I basically got invited into this world, which is like expansive, full of expansive landscapes of pain and suffering, sacrifice and commitment, science and knowledge. And I'm kind of wading through archives that are leading me through syphilis wards and amputee chambers, floating and standing laboratories, clinics, quarantine camps. And throughout, you begin to see how disease is a kind of realm of discovery and conquest, diagnosis and treatment. The lines between hunter and healer are really often very blurry. And medicine and its treatment, and disease and its treatment, are really these kind of fruitful generative spaces to build racial categories, okay? And everyone is kind of involved in building a state in which basically white rule is dominant. And Naim and Syrian Christians like him are on the front lines of that because they're involved in campaigns in the South, which were around the disease of sleeping sickness, okay? And sleeping sickness is this really crazy disease that is at the foundation of tropical medicine, okay? And basically, the Sudan Medical Department is really kind of consolidating, along with multiple imperial forces, this field of tropical medicine. And the people on the front lines of using disease as a boundary marker are these Syrian Christians. So what does it look like for these guys? So what it looks like for them is this. They think it's going to be social mobility and capital, and that they're going to get to really finally become the chosen junior partners that they have been promised to be in this place. But then they get there, and two sets of things happen. One, they understand that they're actually more objects than subjects of empire. So they begin to understand, oh, we're colonized just like these, in their minds, just like these Black Sudanese people are, right? So they begin to think, okay, wait, these people, these British imperial people that we have invested all of this like Anglophilia and confessional, they're actually not gonna help us, right? But also we're different from and superior to these Black people. We might mediate between them, but we're still better than them, right? And so what is happening in this period is the way that I believe that the very category of the Arab is taking shape as a modern anti-colonial, anti-imperial subjectivity, right? So the invitation here isn't only to see how Blackness is shifting over time, but it's also to really see how the category Arab, as we're using it, is taking shape and shifting in different ways. And one of the things, although I won't expand too much on this now, that has been really exciting to me is the way that people like Naim actually are serving as mediators between the multiplicity of healing practices in Sudan and what we would call Western biomedicine. Indeed, healing practices were as abundant as the peoples of Sudan, peoples that British colonial officials and their handlers, including the Syrian Christians, would attempt to contain in that term, the native. When Naim and Anisi and Sada returned to Palestine from Sudan sometime in 1919, their lives are overturned and the formulas are different. Now Palestinians are themselves enfolded in this same category, the native, a native unworthy of land, of politics, of peoplehood, in the civilizational gradations of a British rule committed to the Zionist enterprise in Palestine. So Naim was the man of capital and Anise was the woman of thrift that I spent a decade researching. And they deepened my thinking about these actors, and their archives really have complicated how I've understood law, debt, and property. They showed me new ways to understand state formation too. Naim's petition, so he spends the last 15 years of his life petitioning around his property. And they really reveal how Zionist institutions use the mundane mechanisms of bureaucracy to shape state power. And my great-grandfather was many things. Among them, he was a very committed bureaucrat. But his linguistic and procedural fluency in Ottoman and British bureaucracy would not protect him from the formidable structure of Israeli laws and regulations that rendered him present on the land, but absent in the law. So during the War of 1948, Naim and Anise's children and grandchildren would take refuge in Lebanon and Egypt. The couple would stay on the land in an attempt to hold on to their own and Palestine's shrinking remains. They lost that battle in 1951 and spent the rest of their lives in Lebanon, impoverished and dispossessed refugees. No story of race and catastrophe in Palestine is complete without attending to the brutal force of European nationalism that racialized the Jewish body as unassimilable. We know this. Zionism was one response of many to the ubiquity of anti-Semitism and its location in the state ideologies and structures that culminated into the genocide of the Jewish people. The limits of Zionism's self-definition as a liberation movement were immediately apparent to its primary but not only victims, the Palestinians. We know that Palestinian Zionism did not depart from civilizational hierarchies it sought refuge from. We know it actually refashioned them. And we also know, and many people in this room and far beyond have taught us, how Zionism also victimized Jewish people. And this is an image that I always use in the classroom, because I think, again, it invites us to think about the multiplicity. What does it mean? What does this image look like to you? Right? These Shoah survivors, right, in this almost triumphant image that is inextricable from a triumphant nation. And another image that I often use is this image of Yemeni Jews in a resettlement camp in Beirut in 1950, and the echoes it has with other forms of displacement. So I wonder sometimes, Palestine is a site of catastrophe, but maybe it's also a site of refuge. After all, survivors of the two genocides that defined the 20th century, the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust, found refuge in Palestine. We all know, too, that Palestine is more than just a place of catastrophe. It's a place of formation. And here, the story that I'm telling is really, just part of all of the brilliant people in this room with us today: Nadia Abul-Hajj, Brana Bandar, Noura Arakat, Daryl Lee, Lana Tatur, many, many more people are in this room, Julia Elishar. All of these people have really been challenging us on different levels to think about social, economic, and political patterns, and how do we analyze them. And I think the scholarship on race in particular is really inviting people in the United States to move beyond the confines of North American understandings of race and to recenter empire in those broader queries. And here, if you're remembering my conversation with Wilderson, I want to say that Arab anti-Blackness is not simply or only a product of European colonialism. It has its own genealogies, but it is not essential nor self-evident. It's a historical, contingent, dynamic process, just as the construction of the Arab itself is a shifting and dynamic process. And I think only by taking this history seriously can we transcend the ahistorical understandings of Arab Black or Arab African, right, as binaries. I think in the age of catastrophe, I'm wrapping up, I promise. I know it's been very light and fun today. In the age of catastrophe, Palestine can also be a paradigm. It can teach us about our present condition of the permanent temporary. We're all unclear what the future holds. We're all suspended in time with no end in sight. And I think this idea of violence and dispossession as an interruption is kind of being eroded in many different places where that was felt like a self-evident, right? And in that sense, I think Palestine is not a laboratory in any sense, not just in that sense. Palestine is not a laboratory. It is not a site of sympathy. It is not a problem to be solved. It is a place of abundance, an abundance of lessons about persisting in the looped and looping time of the present, and the way that we have to live inside and exceed the regimes of the human. And I think, like many other struggles, Palestine reminds us, in the words of Jody Bird, that the post has not yet arrived. There is no post-colonial, post-racial, post-Zionist. We cannot await a secular salvation or a messianic apocalypse. We are in the apocalypse. And here I think we can dig deep into various historical traditions to cultivate responses to this apocalypse. I hold very close the lessons of Rosemary Sayer, who taught us about storytelling as fugitive historiography. And I'm reading her alongside this scholar, Deborah Cohen, who has gone back to how in the 19th century scientific descriptions of earthquakes were synthesized from eyewitness accounts that were called felt reports, just ordinary people. And I think the invitation there is to listen for the stories in the information and the information in the stories, to see storytelling and information not quite as much in a binary as we have been thinking about it. And I think we return first and foremost to the Palestinians of the present, holding ground under immense duress, shaping fugitive joy amidst the relentless force to destroy them. Returning, I think we can return to the elderly sheikh making his way to Fajr prayers as Israeli arsenal rained down on Gaza City. I think we can look to the families breaking their fast in the Aqsa compound, and to the children playing in, through, and despite the brutal realities of settler governance. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So thank you so much for that incredibly rich talk. I think we have, Simone, how long are we have till 8, a little before 8? Okay, so we have plenty of time for Q&A, and I want to open the conversation, because I'm going to have a lot of time talking to you. Questions, comments, if you want to begin. Yeah, go ahead.
Sherene, I think I'm amongst the folks who have heard about your notes, and every single time. How you come to that, and how that becomes part of other methods that you've been exploring, and also showing us in self-referential work in terms of what we might call indigenous resurgence, but also in relation to Saadia Hartman, who you mentioned. And then the second question is still a return to Frank Wilderson and thinking about the interminable proposition that Afro-pessimists make to us, which is that there is no escape from the afterlives of slavery as an ontological point of departure beyond the destruction of man. And what in your own work, right, and exploring anti-Blackness, both obviously as an afterlife of slavery, but also of these colonial regimes, if you've thought of any responses to that, an affirmation or along with against it. About that.
Thank you. Photographs. I am still learning. I need to learn more about how to read photographs. I'm sort of very hesitant about it because it's, again, outside my comfort zone. But I'm relying on Tina Kempt and many others who have taught us how to do that the work with photographs and the violence within them. And I like to see them for now as portals in which I'm trying to be both thinking of how they offer me a bridge to my ancestors. So often how I like to think about it is, that I never met Naeem, but he touched these photographs, and now I'm touching these photographs. So there's somehow a kind of connection between. So that's the way I'm trying to foster it. But yes, thank you for bringing up the pain, because it's a painful project. It's a painful project in every sense, in even the kind of intimate ways that families break down. That families always come broken. Never mind the Nakba, So I have these 80 photographs, and I say to myself every day, start the day by looking at the photograph, just start the day by looking and going deep. And they're kind of like anchors and portals in that way. On the death drive, and not the inevitability of death, I mean, I rely much more on the Black feminist tradition. And the Black feminist tradition teaches us about love and radical ways to imagine the future and be together in space. And I'm feeling more and more exhausted by Afro-pessimism, honestly. And I don't think I'm the only one. I mean, I do take some in some ways, I feel like the argument has reached its limits, like even within and among the Black radical tradition. And like you've taught me a lot of this stuff, like turning to also Black joy and Fred Moten. And, I think I find more, I don't think I could ever convince Frank Wilderson. You know what I mean? I don't think he would ever be in this room, and I don't think he would ever be convinced about anything that I would say, but he's not convincing me either, So I don't know if that gets at the complexity of your question, but.
I'm gonna jump in for a second while people gather their thoughts. I have two unrelated thoughts. One goes to the Frank Wilderson. So the issue about, I don't know if it's worked that well, but the claim of that foundational claim of Afro-pessimism is that anti-Blackness stands at the very foundation, right, of the modern world, and in fact, as a global claim. And so in that sense, I think it would be interesting to think about the way, I mean, as you say, slavery in the Arab world has a different genealogy, right? And as you also note when you start, that everyone of a certain class, this would be their story. But in the context of, let's say, the US, all sorts of whites who were not particularly elite owned slaves, besides the foundational kind of structure of capitalism upon which that was built on slavery. So I guess one question, if one thinks about even thinking in conversation with Wilderson, is to think about a very different, I mean, the point is that I don't really have an answer, but that you note that it has a very different history, but also it's the question of what you do with the foundational claim that this is the foundational and enduring violence, right? And how that is a story of the new world in a way that is perhaps not translatable. And then my other comment, which is completely unrelated, so I was thinking about catastrophe. And there's so much work also in various fields these days about not just the catastrophic, but slow violence or, right, sort of the quasi-event, et cetera. And I guess I wanted to think a bit about how one thinks about contemporary destruction in Palestine, not just in terms of the child killed, but this kind of enduring kind of violence that is kind of below the surface of that catastrophic or spectacular. Anyway.
Yeah, thank you so much. About the formation of anti-Blackness as this kind of base logic. There is stuff about that that's compelling to me, even in the context that is differentiated in the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean. Because even despite and with, as you say, the class differences and the different structures, there's a functioning anti-Blackness that I have been able to trace in the work that I do, right? I don't think that I want us to be thinking critically about how that changes over time, and that Blackness itself is a category that's changing all the time. But this is something that I take one of the younger scholars who I didn't mention is a scholar named Zach Mondesiri, who asks the question, who's Black when everybody's Black? And he works in Southern Sudan and Northern Sudan, and he talks about how is it in Northern Sudan that people to us look Black, but to them they're not Black, in conversation with how they understand the Southern Sudanese, right? Or the history of, let's say, the people, and I think the last time I saw you, Brink, we talked about this, about what people are known as the Akhdam or the Muhammadin in Yemen, right? Who are in this kind of caste-based structure of Blackness that's an untouchability. And I think one of the things that is different about racialized claims and claims around Blackness and anti-Blackness is its links to genealogy, who I wouldn't be, shy to say much about in your presence, but like it is very much around these kinds of questions of, well, what types of claims to indigeneity and genealogy that people make. So I don't want to foreclose the possibility that anti-Blackness is a kind of functioning paradigm that we have to think about. Absolutely, it's different, right? You have Jahez writing about his Blackness, in a text that has not been translated. So I think there are questions around, this is why this new generation, I work with a student named Guhesh Sheikh, who's working around with Mohammishin or Akhdam in Yemen. And some of the stuff she's kind of revealing around genealogical claims and how they function is really humbling and making me see things in new ways. But I think you're right that this is a kind of central question that we have to keep asking. Also about slow violence, absolutely. I mean, this is one of the things that I think is the task of how do we think about that kind of grinding everyday erosion and debilitating kind of slow violence in conversation with the catastrophic, and maybe that is what catastrophe is at this moment. Yeah.
I appreciated how you kind of critically pointed out that in his later life he spent maybe 15 years just in the bureaucratic process trying to prove himself, and I think that's still reflected in modern day Palestinian activism. And I was wondering what ultimately is your perspective on how we navigate that now?
Like writing petitions and stuff?
For example, when people get their land taken away, they might go to the Israeli Supreme Court and stuff like
I see
that.
what you're saying. I mean, my sense is like everybody has to fight their way. You know what I mean? Like I think we have to fight on every battle, and I think it's up to us and what our capacities are. I mean, I do want to say that, the Middle East Studies Association, thanks to a lot of the people in this room, has passed a boycott, divestment, sanctions resolution, and that is revolutionary because that association began as an outgrowth of U.S. power and the Zionist stronghold within it. And we didn't do it in a way, I mean, I don't know. We're recording this, but maybe we won't. Okay. But yeah, we can edit. We can take out the question and answer, but we did it in a way that also preserved the integrity of the association. We kept the association in place. Now, what does that mean concretely? Let me just, ajiba min al-akhir. We have won the moral political battlefield. We've won that battlefield. We are losing on the actual battlefield. How we bridge that, I have no idea. I think I would follow your lead on that, since you're the generation that's going to take it over.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. The first couple of questions touched on the question of genealogies of Blackness, and I wanted to ask you about whiteness, which you also gestured to, or in fact explicitly mentioned in the talk, and you said something I thought very compelling about the need to historicize whiteness and to be particularly attentive to the language of the actors that we look at when we speak of these racial categories. And you said that in terms of the category white, that both your great-grandfather, if I'm not mistaken, and the British imperial interlocutors that he had used the language of whiteness, right? And I was very interested in that within this broader framework of trying to, study race, but also study it in a way that's historicized and nuanced. What has that language taught you about that category as it manifests itself in a particular setting rather than an ahistorical one? Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, this is a conversation that is so rich and important. Again, I'll say, like, just to give you concretely in the Sudan situation, okay? So what I have noticed is first that looking at everything from Sudan has changed how I understand things that I thought I understood, like the Faisali experiment in Damascus, for example, right? Because there are colonial officials in Sudan, Syrian Christians, in fact, that are taking part in that experiment at the same time that other struggles for sovereignty are contemporaneously taking part in, say, Darfur, somebody named Ali Dinar. Okay. And so one of the things that I think when we're turning to, and I mean, I think here your point is really right on about really thinking about the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery and the whole story in North America cannot be like where we begin from and what we compare to. It's a different context, right? And I think one of the things that has been so mind-blowing for me about Sudan is that it allows me to understand whiteness and blackness as constructs in formation happening at the same time in this place in a mutuality and relationality. And my preliminary and very vulgar hypothesis is that for these people, these Syrian Christians, they're doing something that is familiar to us, that Egyptian, like what Taha Hussein would later do, what Bustani would do in some ways, what different actors are doing, which are linking their claims to civilizational superiority and sovereignty to how they understand themselves and position themselves. And these Syrian Christians understand themselves as white in comparison to the Black Sudanese around them. And they understand themselves as white civilizationally and superior civilizationally and superior to their Muslim brethren. Then when they see that ship has sailed and nobody's going to get independence, neither you nor the Muslims, then they're like, okay, no, let's talk about our Arabness. It's not that cynical, but you get what I'm saying, right? Like, so I think there's a way that these claims and constructions are deeply linked to claims around sovereignty, and claims for independence and worth and, worthiness. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. I thought that was really wonderful. I have a comment and a question. The comment is actually more on this, just picking up the idea of Sudan and Egypt's relationship to Palestine during the Mandate period. I look at maps of Palestine, and I was shocked by how much of the infrastructure of mapping Palestine was informed by the practices and policies of mapping Egypt and Sudan during the Yusuf era. So I just thought that was like another thread that I didn't see coming through your talk, so I'm grateful for that. But my question is about triangulating catastrophe, climate catastrophe, which is where you began your talk, abundance, which is a theme that threaded throughout, and then hope, which is where I felt like you ended your talk. And I was reading an article by Rebecca Solnit, who's a geographer and writer, and she writes about how people's reticence about making changes for a climate future comes from a fear of deprivation. They think a change will lead to deprivation, and we currently live in a period of abundance. And she was arguing the opposite. What if we currently live in a period of deprivation through emissions, through extinction, and all the things you were mentioning? And actually, what we could go towards is a climate future which is one of abundance. And I was interested in the idea that Palestine is a site of abundance and not a site of solution, and also the ending of hope. So I was just wondering if you could comment to, I guess, where you began the talk, which was climate catastrophe, and ending it on such a hopeful note of abundance and resilience, and whether there's actually a direct correlation between those two things.
I mean, I feel like you helped me understand my thinking in the way you just broke that down. So I'm grateful to you. Like, I hadn't seen that thread, and it's really hard to think of these things together. Like, it's really painful and hard. But the reason I started with the climate is because I live in California. Do you know what I mean? Also, it's 80 degrees here in New York. Do you know? I'm like, it's hotter here than it is in California. That's just weird. Okay. So it's this constant thing. And you know why it's so interesting to me because I came to UCSB from Cairo, from revolutionary Cairo, and I got to the campus and it was so idyllic and beautiful. And I was like, oh my God, I'm never going to get to do anything here. All I think about is hope and despair. And here it's just going to be like these kids in their flip flops and their skateboards and they're surfing all the time. And it's not going to make any sense. And why am I here? And I still think, why am I here everywhere? But, you know, these students, I don't have to teach them that things don't always get better. They're in debt, they're impoverished, they work 3 to 4 jobs, and I don't have to at any point talk to them about teleology. You know what and now I'm getting to a place in my everyday life where like every day people that I'm honored to live, like my trainer is like, I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow and I don't think I can plan for it. So, and that's because of the mudslides and all of this amazing ways in which like we are now having to live in a permanent temporary where we can't plan for the future. And I think you're absolutely right about, I want to read this article that you mentioned. I cut this part in the end because I started getting nervous that I was going on for too long. But there's this wonderful Indigenous scholar, Kylie White, who says, you know, we live in what our ancestors would understand as the dystopia. We are in the dystopia. We are in the apocalypse. We don't have to imagine it. And I think you're absolutely right that kind of, for me, Indigenous studies or an indigeneity as method has been a real place of refuge and hope. But I'll be honest that I ended with this little girl. I was so happy to find this image of this happy, smiling little girl. Sometimes I say that to convince myself also. And in the last, I have to be honest, like, I mean, the people who know me and love me know I'm such a revolutionary, sentimental, like, I'm so sentimental about revolution, even though I lived one and it was awful. But I'm getting more and more despairing, to be honest. Like the last 4 months, and you know, Noor and I talk about this all the time. It's like in Palestine, it's just feels so suffocating, and I don't see where the exit is, except to think about how is this generalized catastrophe much more of a shared condition than it used to be in the past. And your invitation to think about the time that we're in as a time of lack or not abundance is, I think that's really powerful, and I'll keep that with me. Thank you.
I wanted to say one thing about that. It's interesting because you, well, people thinking when you're saying you don't have to, you know, these are kids that are buried under debt, and California's, you know, about to fall into the sea or something. That these aren't kids that you have to teach, like that you have to untake teleology for them. That things will get better, but in fact, and I just say this as a comment. It seems that sort of where you end your, to go back to the question, where you end your talk on hope, although you sort of so much of it is about the catastrophic, that it seems to me of this symptomatic moment of progressive politics, not just in Palestine, but in general, where in fact, we are still holding on to a teleology, right? Like, why end on hope? Like, it's not clear to me that that's not where the teleology lies, that there's still some sense that in the end, you know, progressive politics will win. Maybe not.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just thought about
Yeah.
it.
No, I think that's absolutely fair, and I think you're right, and I have to think of, I have to think about that more. I guess I didn't see it as ending on hope as much as ending on joy, which is a little bit different from hope. Like, you know what I mean? I guess the things that give me relief are people picnicking and people singing and people making good food and people just being everyday normal people in Palestine. So I guess that's more of what I was gesturing to, but I think your broader critique of progressive politics and teleology is right on, and I have to think more about that.
think we need it for the recording, which we might cut.
Thank you so much for this amazing talk. As you were speaking and during the Q&A, I started to think also with you about Palestine being a really generative space to come back to a sometimes contentious conversation between Afro-pessimism and indigenous studies, and that Palestine can be a rare, so I wonder if you could just speak a little bit to that, how you're putting these things together and maybe articulating them in a new way.
Thank you so much. I mean, I'm your student on this, and you've taught me so much about indigenous studies and really thinking together with that. And I guess to get back to like the progressive maybe, which is that I feel like what offers me exits are real radical politics, like really not progress. And I think the very language of progress is the opposite of that in a way, right? And so I don't know, when I was reading In Transit by Jody Bird, and when she gets to that chapter where she's talking about the Cherokee Nation stripping the ancestors of freedmen of their citizenship, and she's just taking it on like fearlessly, and really getting at both on the one hand, how do you take the 560 nations of Turtle Island and put them in this category of the native. That's what made me helped me think about Sudan, right? All of this multiplicity being kind of brought down to this category. And I guess those are I feel like putting people like Jody Bird in conversation with, although some of these folks are gone, but people like the tradition of folks like Audre Lorde, scholars like Felice Blake, people who are really engaging with the questions of radical ways forward is, for me, I think we learn a lot from Afro-pessimism, but again, I think the more productive conversations are ones that are really doing that radical, again, the cold winds of self-scrutiny, right? Instead of some of the work that you read, which is really kind of leaning on maintaining a particular category as the most abject. That feels to me like I don't know how much further I can go with that, right? And that's why I love my great grandfather, because he was all so many different things at the same time, and he's such a good puzzle in thinking and holding all of the different ways that he was in the world. And I think Darwish says something like all of our grandfathers were conquering, and that gives me a sort of relief in that conversation. So
Constant destruction. And Professor Levy spoke here a few years ago, and I read his book, and it's been going on for ages, the cumulative dispossession. But then we have this monstrous building down on 42nd Street, the UN, and I'm wondering, does it have any role in Palestine? Is it making any progress? What is its role?
Well, I will direct you to my dear friend Noura Arakat, who wrote a book called Justice for Some, in which she's really taking on the question of law as both a space of enabling our dispossession, but the place also where we have fought it. So I think, yeah, I'll let you take that question. I think it's both. I think that international law, as difficult as it is and as dispossessing and stripping that it has also been a space of maneuver and leverage and strategy. And I think we have to use literally every space we have access to.
Okay, any final questions? I think we're exhausting our speaker here, so I'm happy to liberate her. No. You're good? Well, I think we're all happy, so there we go. Yeah, thank you. I want to thank you immensely for such a rich talk and conversation, and I'm so glad we managed to get you here. Thank you. Apparently, there's a reception in the other room, so the conversation can continue. But
Also, I want to thank Simone Rakowitz for all the amazing hospitality.
yes,
that she's given
absolutely,
us.
I should have done that. Thank you, Simone.
Like really, so much.
And Sylvia
wonderful
for pulling
people
the-
making this happen.